War has always celebrated its polished heroes. The generals who drew lines on maps, the officers who issued commands with steady voices, the soldiers who charged into enemy fire. Yet behind every shining moment carved into history, there existed men who never appeared in photographs, who never received speeches, who never had their names spoken during victory parades. They were shadows in the rear, moving tons of supplies across roads that swallowed everything placed upon them. In 1944, across a shattered France, these men drove trucks and carried on their backs the fate of entire armies. The dawn had not yet found its color, when the engine growled alive, the cold cut through layers of clothing, a sharp reminder that the night offered no comfort, only silence and threat. The driver inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of oil, dust and warm metal, as mist drifted between the trees. It was there, in that grey emptiness, that his journey began. There would be no applause, no witnesses, only the road, always the road. The convoy moved like a creature with countless limbs, slow, heavy, relentless, tires crushed thick mud, turning the ground into a hungry paste that tried to hold each vehicle in place like a silent predator. Nothing on that path was stable. Post-D-Day France was a land carved by craters, charred wrecks, splintered roots, and scars left by weeks of brutal fighting. Every meter whispered the same warning. The enemy had been here and could return. Inside the cab, the driver felt the constant vibration of the engine, a heartbeat that would follow him through every second of the journey. There was no comfort, no space, only noise, pressure and the knowledge that his mission had a single rule: do not stop. On the Red Ball Express, stopping meant being swallowed by darkness, hit by a lurking threat, or worse, blocking the vital lifeline that kept entire divisions alive. On that road, movement was survival. The world outside looked frozen in tension. Shattered trees reached toward the sky like exposed bones. Shadows drifted unpredictably under a fractured moon. The wind carried the distant breath of gunfire and smoke, as if the war itself was exhaling across the land. And yet the driver pressed forward, not for glory but because thousands of men, miles ahead, depended on what rattled inside the cargo bed behind him. Fuel, life, momentum. He doubted anyone would ever understand the weight of this silent responsibility. But that morning, as the convoy disappeared into the dense fog, one truth remained unquestionable. Without these invisible drivers, no victory would ever move forward. The darkness seemed to thicken as the convoy pushed deeper into the night, as if the very air resisted the passage of those trucks across its silent territory. The driver felt the steering wheel tremble under his hands, every vibration echoing the deep craters scarring the road. It was nearly impossible to distinguish where the path ended and the battlefield began. Bomb craters had reshaped the landscape into a jagged maze, and each deviation demanded more from the truck than it should have ever been able to give. Inside the cramped cab, a chorus of relentless noises filled the space. The strain of the engine, the creaking of metal under tension, the heavy drums of fuel slamming rhythmically against one another in the back. It was a mechanical heartbeat, relentless and uneven, reminding the driver that his mission depended not only on courage, but on the survival of the machine beneath him. The cargo wasn't just metal and fuel. It was the continuation of an offensive that needed momentum before the enemy could recover. The fog grew thicker, turning the headlights into a faint cone of pale light that barely pierced a few meters ahead. The world shrank to a narrow strip of mud, smoke and shifting shadows. At times, the silhouettes of destroyed vehicles emerged along the roadside: charred tanks, abandoned enemy trucks, twisted carcasses of steel that told silent stories of ambushes and failures. To the driver, each wreck was a reminder that the road was never neutral. It belonged to danger. The scent of burning diesel merged with the heavy smell of damp earth. Air pushed through the cab's vents, carrying fragments of leaves, dust and ash. Everything felt saturated with war. Even when the landscape lay still, It radiated tension. In certain moments, the silence of the dawn was more unsettling than the distant rumble of artillery. The driver knew the threat wasn't only in the curves. It lived beneath the unstable ground, where mines waited unseen. It lived in the sky, where a lone enemy aircraft could appear without warning. It lived in the dense forests, flanking the road, where unseen eyes might track the convoy's movement. Yet he pressed on, keeping the engine's rhythm steady, as if it were a mantra of survival. The other trucks followed in tight formation, forming an unbroken chain cutting through the darkness. Each man in each cab carried the same burden, the understanding that their invisible role kept an entire war moving. It was a silent weight, heavy but undeniable. And on that early morning in Normandy, the road seemed intent on testing every one of them, curve after curve, meter after meter. As the convoy pressed forward, the road seemed to transform into a living organism, reacting to the weight of the trucks as if trying to push them back. Each new stretch revealed a fresh threat. Mud so deep it clung to the tires like unseen hands, narrow passages where shattered trees formed dark tunnels, and long open areas where vulnerability stretched out with every passing meter. To the driver, the road was not merely a route, it was a silent adversary, unpredictable and always waiting for a moment of weakness. The horizon began to adopt a faint blue hue, signaling the slow advance of dawn, but the emerging light offered no comfort. It simply exposed the scars of the land with greater clarity. Loose gravel, fresh craters, tracks left by burned-out vehicles. The driver absorbed every detail with absolute focus, knowing that even the smallest lapse could turn an ordinary bend into a fatal end. On the Red Ball Express, a single mistake carried consequences far beyond the cab of one truck. The trucks moved in an unbroken line, a metal serpent weaving through the ruined landscape. The steady rhythm of their movement was almost hypnotic, and it was that very rhythm that prevented the entire operation from collapsing. Each driver depended on the next. One truck stuck in mud or disabled by damage could block miles of supplies, delaying entire offensives and forcing divisions to face the enemy without ammunition or fuel. This knowledge weighed more heavily on the driver than exhaustion ever could, and exhaustion was constant. Days without proper rest blurred the edges of reality. His eyelids grew heavy, his vision occasionally softened for fractions of a second. His body, confined in the vibrating cab, begged for pause, but nothing in war offered rest to the invisible. The driver had long learned to ignore the ache in his back, the tension in his muscles, the dryness in his throat. The road demanded every drop of his focus and strength. In the cold air, the faint, distant hum of aircraft engines drifted above. The driver kept his eyes fixed on the path, though his heartbeat quickened. He knew that in this region, even a lone enemy plane, lost, desperate, or simply opportunistic, could turn miles of roadway into a corridor of fire and destruction. The shifting cloud cover made any approach uncertain. Still, the convoy pressed on without hesitation. The hostile road continued revealing its dangers. Improvised bridges that groaned under weight, bends where fog thickened into near opacity, and stretches where rain-soaked earth seemed ready to collapse beneath the trucks. The driver knew each risk intimately, yet he never slowed. He didn't have that luxury. The mission did not allow hesitation. There, in the heart of a shattered France, a man no one would ever know carried the burden of keeping an entire war in motion. He was only a driver, yet in that moment he was the thin line separating advance from collapse. The faint light emerging on the horizon revealed only fragments of the devastation that marked the region. Yet it also brought something more unsettling. Silence. A heavy, dense silence that settled over the trees, the mud, and even inside the cab. The driver knew that in war, silence never meant safety. More often it was merely the breath held before something worse. And on that morning, every second felt weighted with warning. The road carried the convoy through narrow valleys where fog pooled like a thick veil, hiding everything beyond a few meters. Shadows shifted with the movement of leaves, creating constant illusions. For a fatigued driver, the mind could easily transform any glimmer or shape into danger. Yet, he needed absolute focus. The road did not forgive distraction. Improvised communication lines, strung along the route, swayed with the wind, producing a faint metallic creak that seemed to echo alongside the convoy. It felt as though they were traveling through a landscape abandoned by the living, a place where only machines and shadows remained. The driver observed everything with instinctive vigilance, guided by reflexes shaped purely by survival. Even as the sun began to push past the horizon, its weak light barely penetrated the heavy lid of clouds. The world kept its same grey, cold, hostile tone. Nothing in the scenery hinted at human presence, only the remains of accumulated destruction, fallen trees, deep impact scars, dark stains on the earth marking recent and violent clashes. Here, even the silence felt wounded. The driver's body begged for rest, but he shut out every physical complaint. The steering wheel seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, resisting his hands. The constant vibration of the engine spread a dull numbness through his arms and legs, yet every discomfort was smothered by responsibility. He knew the entire convoy relied on his stability, and the front line relied on the convoy. The road began a gentle curve to the right, revealing a more open stretch. The terrain appeared deceptively safe, but the driver understood how misleading that impression was. Open ground was a natural invitation for air attacks. The Luftwaffe was weakened at this stage of the war. Yet, solitary aircraft still appeared on desperate missions, capable of turning calm minutes into absolute chaos. Far ahead, the driver noticed a thin column of smoke rising toward the sky, not tall enough to indicate a fresh fire, but distinct enough to signal activity. Perhaps an Allied camp, perhaps the remnants of an earlier clash, or perhaps something far less welcoming. In war, every shadow carried two possibilities, refuge or disaster. Without reducing speed, the driver sharpened his focus. The road narrowed once again, and the silence persisted, heavy, anticipatory, like a held breath before a decisive moment. It was the kind of silence that often preceded turning points, the ones capable of transforming a simple mission into a bitter memory or a story never told. The road continued to narrow, forcing the driver to suppress every instinct that might draw his focus away. Everything demanded precision. The damp ground turned gentle curves into treacherous traps, while loose stones created sudden jolts that echoed through the cab like quiet warnings. Each vibration reminded him that progress wasn't guaranteed. It was earned, inch by inch, in a fragile negotiation between survival and collapse. The convoy moved like a lifeline, pulsing through a wounded landscape. As the trucks advanced, they carved deep tracks into the mud, tracks that the next rainstorm would erase and the world would forget. Yet in that moment, those grooves represented the thin boundary between an advancing army and one left stranded. The driver felt that weight. He knew that more than fuel, he carried continuity, and continuity, in this war, was as valuable as artillery fire. The ground began to slope upward, not a steep climb, but enough to force the engine into a deeper, more laborious growl, blending power with fatigue. Each meter felt like a struggle against the earth itself, as if the soil were reaching upward to pull the truck back. The driver leaned slightly forward, an involuntary reflex, as though his body could help push the machine through the resistance. It was a small gesture, but it revealed a truth. He and the truck had become a single organism. The surroundings reflected this transformation. Twisted trees rose along the incline like silent witnesses to a journey few would ever appreciate. The wind carried dead leaves that slapped softly against the truck's frame, producing brief, almost human-like touches. The road had a life of its own, and that life seemed intent on testing every ounce of the driver's resolve. As the convoy neared the crest, the terrain ahead grew more uneven. Old bomb craters, partially filled with rainwater, formed dark pools that mirrored the grey sky. The driver knew better than to trust their stillness. Beneath that reflective surface might lie deep voids capable of tearing off an axle. He chose his path with the same care. A man chooses a decisive step in unfamiliar ground. When the truck finally reached the top, the landscape unfurled before him. Vast, scarred fields stretched into the distance, marked by long wounds and remnants of recent battles. The sight was both grand and devastating, but to the driver it served only as a reminder of what remained ahead. The descent would begin soon, and descents were always more dangerous than climbs. He drew a slow breath, steadied his posture, and kept both hands firm on the wheel. The crest wasn't a place to rest. It was merely the transition to a greater challenge. And he knew that as long as the engine kept breathing, so would he. The descent began subtly, almost unnoticed at first. Yet any seasoned driver understood that gentle slopes often hid the most treacherous dangers. Gravity became a silent adversary, pushing the truck forward, testing the brakes, challenging control. The driver adjusted his posture, took a steady breath, and let the cab vibrate with the engine as he entered the most delicate stretch of the route so far. The tires met the unstable ground with an uneasy combination of grip and uncertainty. Any loose stone could alter the truck's direction. Any streak of mud could pull the vehicle toward a place it wasn't meant to go. Controlling the speed became a tense dance between maintaining the convoy's rhythm and preventing the machine from surrendering to the natural pull of the slope. It was a moment where even the smallest error could quickly escalate into something irreversible. The view ahead grew wider as the convoy descended, revealing broad valleys and remnants of old, ruined roads. Yet this openness brought no comfort. Instead, it exposed the trucks to unknown watchers, hidden in distant forests or behind abandoned wreckage. The driver knew that despite Allied air superiority, a single enemy aircraft could turn that stretch into a deadly corridor. With every meter, the road demanded its toll. Puddles of rainwater concealed deep holes capable of jolting the truck violently, threatening the stability of the cargo. The steering wheel felt heavier here, resisting movement as though it understood the stakes. The driver held firm, feeling cold sweat on his palms, ignoring the accelerated pulse in his chest. In war, even a descent required courage. The convoy maintained its formation, though silence hung over it like an unwritten agreement. Every driver sensed instinctively that this section of road required absolute respect. The predominant sound was the collective rumble of engines, echoing across the valley like a single deep breath. The driver focused on the distance between his truck and the one ahead, alert to any shift, any deviation. One misplaced wheel could trigger a chain reaction, sending vehicles sliding, blocking the route, and halting the lifeline, sustaining an entire offensive. He remembered, not willingly, but because the mind brings back what warns us, other accidents on different routes. Trucks overturned, stuck beyond rescue, cargo lost in muddy ravines. War held many invisible enemies, and the road was among the most unforgiving. Still, the driver kept his pace. Not because he trusted the terrain, but because he trusted his own resolve. In that moment, he and the machine functioned as a single entity, fighting the slope. One misstep could be fatal, yet stopping wasn't an option. The valley crept closer, bringing with it a new set of complexities. The driver took another deep breath, bracing himself for whatever came next. The descent was nearly over, but the road, as always, was already preparing its next challenge. The valley emerged slowly before him, widening into an open expanse, where the road no longer felt like a confined passage, but a vulnerable line drawn across shattered fields. Yet, the sensation was not one of freedom. It was exposure. In that vast space, the driver felt like a small, solitary figure on a giant board, watched by unseen eyes, hidden within the hills and ruins. Openness, instead of bringing relief, became a reminder that everything here could be seen, and everything could be struck. As the convoy advanced, the terrain shifted unpredictably between firm ground and areas still saturated from the recent rainfall. The differences were subtle, but the vibrations through the steering wheel and the pressure on the pedals told the driver exactly what lay beneath each meter. In some sections, the mud threatened to swallow the tires, while in others, the soil responded with a rigidness that suggested buried debris or hidden craters waiting to catch the unaware. The surrounding fields bore the scars of previous fighting: dried craters, collapsed structures, remnants of artillery, and vehicles long abandoned to rust. Each trace held the echo of those who had passed through before, stories rarely accompanied by favorable endings. The driver studied every detail, not out of curiosity, but because the landscape itself whispered warnings. These signs were instructions for survival, silent but urgent. Many convoys had faced their worst moments in this very valley. The shape of the terrain favored ambushes, lingering artillery fire, and sudden airstrikes from enemy pilots, who, despite dwindling numbers, still launched desperate attacks whenever an exposed target presented itself. The driver knew all of this. His body reacted instinctively, muscles coiled, breathing controlled, eyes wide and alert. This was not a place that allowed trust. The convoy spread out slightly, increasing the distance between trucks to reduce the chance of cascading destruction if one was hit. Each driver moved as if alone, yet all remained bound by a shared mission: keep the pace, keep the supplies moving, keep the front alive. Their unity did not need words. It was forged through countless miles of shared risk, through the mutual understanding that if one fell, all felt the impact. The driver felt the weight of anticipation settle over him. He knew he was entering a place where danger didn't merely exist. It breathed. Every shadow could hide an explosive residue of threat. Every bend could mask a fatal obstacle. And the worst of all was that danger rarely announced itself. The unexpected was the only constant. Still, the truck pressed forward. It was a quiet testament that strength in war did not come from refusing fear, but from advancing in spite of it. The valley stretched ahead like a long, unforgiving corridor, and the driver understood one unshakable rule: crossing it was mandatory, but stopping was forbidden. As the convoy pushed deeper into the valley, something subtle but unmistakable began to take shape: the sense of being followed, not by a visible enemy, nor by machines or soldiers, but by a shadow that seemed to mirror the truck's progress, stretching and shrinking with the terrain. It was a quiet presence, yet constant enough to make the driver sharpen his attention beyond the limits of comfort. The dim light filtering through the clouds cast stark contrasts across the landscape. Distant hills projected elongated shadows that crawled across the scarred ground, bending and warping into unsettling forms. More than once, the driver caught a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a brief shift in light or a sudden fragment of darkness, only to find nothing concrete when you looked directly. But in war, nothing rarely meant emptiness. Often, it meant something not yet revealed. The truck maintained its steady pace, but the driver felt a growing weight pressing against his awareness. The valley offered no shelter, and the open terrain acted as an amplifier for every sound. Engine noise bounced off the slopes, returning as faint echoes that resembled distant footsteps or machinery that was not part of their column. This distortion of sound forced every driver to lean deeper into concentration, even as fatigue tugged relentlessly at their senses. Dust kicked up by the lead trucks hovered over the valley like a thin veil, blurring the landscape and turning shapes into silhouettes. Ahead, the driver saw only softened outlines: the shadowed form of the truck in front, the faint curves of the road, and the indistinct marks carved into the ground. Everything vibrated with an unsteady energy, as if the air itself expected something to happen. Signs of earlier battles grew more concentrated here. Half-collapsed structures rose from the distance like forgotten skeletons. Dark patches on the earth hinted at fires long extinguished. This place held war not as a memory, but as an imprint, a presence embedded into soil and stone. Anyone crossing it could feel the echo of past violence clinging to the air. When the convoy reached the valley's center, a shift in the wind carried a metallic, cold smell, a blend of churned soil and the residue of old smoke. It was not the scent of an active threat, but of everything that had happened before, and that, in its own way, was even more unsettling. It reminded the driver that this valley had absorbed more than footsteps and tire marks. It had absorbed lives, yet the shadow remained, pacing the convoy with unwavering consistency. Perhaps it was nothing more than the natural interplay of light, dust and broken terrain, or perhaps it was symbolic, a silent reminder of the fragility of those moving through a war so immense. The driver refused to let imagination take hold. In this section of road, imagination was dangerous. Attention was survival. The valley ahead began to narrow again, guiding the convoy toward a tighter, more confined path. And the shadow, whatever its source, seemed to narrow with it, waiting for what came next. The valley began tightening abruptly, as if the terrain itself had decided to compress the convoy into a corridor where every mistake would echo louder than anywhere else. The driver sensed the shift before he fully saw it. The wind became restrained, the echoes sharpened, and the once wide-open road narrowed into a path bordered by steep slopes rising like natural walls. The feeling of confinement was immediate. The road offered no alternatives, no space for correction. Here the trucks became perfect targets. If anything, absolutely anything were to occur. The driver knew this, and his body responded with instinctive tension. His hands gripped the wheel with an almost ritualistic precision, every movement measured down to the millimeter. The ground bore deep scars of erosion. Rainwater rushing down the slopes carved small streams that sliced through the road, leaving behind unpredictable irregularities. Each dip jolted the truck, and this movement rippled through the convoy like a chain reaction, demanding absolute control from every driver involved. Massive boulders loosened by battles long past or simply by time rested close to the path. Some were so large they seemed to watch silently, reminders that nature in this place was as dangerous as any armed enemy. The driver steered around them carefully, knowing that even a minor landslide could block the entire route. Light diminished as the walls of the valley pressed inward. Shadows grew thicker, turning the environment colder and the road harder to read. The driver now relied not only on sight, but on the subtle movements of the truck ahead, maintaining just enough distance to react without breaking the convoy's essential rhythm. The narrow passage amplified every sound, each impact of the tires against the uneven ground, every vibration of the chassis, every mechanical groan from the engines. It was as if the valley were listening and answering. The acoustics twisted the engine noises into distortions that resembled distant movement, phantom presences pacing the convoy from the shadows. The combined effect of echoing sound and tightening darkness awakened ancient instincts, the ones that surface when a person feels cornered, with no clear escape. The driver felt a pressure in his chest, not born of panic but of heightened awareness. In this stretch the road held the power, not the convoy. Dust kicked up by the lead trucks had nowhere to escape. It hung in the air like a dense veil, turning the headlights into pale, shimmering beams that illuminated drifting particles suspended in slow motion. The scene looked almost unreal, as if time itself were hesitating to move forward. Ahead, the passage continued narrowing, promising more strain and more danger. The driver inhaled deeply, steadying himself. The road was closing around them, and he knew this section would test every skill they had. Here, any mistake would not just hinder one truck, it would ripple through the entire line. And the line in this war was everything. The narrow passage began to widen again, but the shift brought no sense of relief. It felt less like emerging into safety and more like stepping into a larger space where danger simply wore a different shape. The truck's engine seemed to breathe with less strain, yet the driver's mind remained locked in heightened awareness. Here, every sound mattered. Every slight change in the road's behavior carried meaning. Then it happened. A dry, sharp crack split the rhythm of the engines. It didn't come from ahead or behind. It came from the ground itself. A noise so brief it could have been mistaken for a rock snapping under a tire. But the driver knew better. His body reacted before thought could form. Muscles tensed, breath halted, and a sudden heavy silence expanded inside the cab. The entire convoy felt it. The road, moments earlier merely uneven, now seemed to pulse with a different kind of vibration, as if something dormant beneath the surface had been disturbed. The driver held his course, but his eyes scanned every inch ahead, searching for the slightest anomaly. A pressure hung in the air, dense and unmistakable, like the charged stillness before a storm reveals itself. The terrain shifted subtly. Small rises and dips appeared more frequently, becoming sharper with each meter traveled. The message was clear. This section wasn't just dangerous, it was unstable. Recent rains had soaked deep into the earth, creating compacted mud pockets and hollow voids where the ground could no longer hold weight. A single misplaced wheel could turn soil into a trap, and the trucks were far too heavy to make mistakes. Dust suspended in the air reacted to the shifting wind, swirling into brief spirals before dissipating. A silent dance, but one the driver recognized. These patterns signaled ground movement, slow, hidden, but real enough to warn of imminent instability. The truck's tires vibrated differently now, not from mechanical strain, but from the terrain signaling its broken foundation. Underneath the road lay scars no one could see, patched over craters, buried fragments of artillery impacts, twisted metal remains from forgotten battles, all hidden beneath a deceptive layer of dirt that appeared solid but was anything but. The driver inhaled slowly, feeling the cold air sharpen his senses. That initial crack could have meant many things: natural shifting of the earth, or the awakening of an old trap. Mines forgotten during retreats often remained where they were buried, waiting for the precise pressure that would trigger them. In this section there was no speeding up, no swerving. The convoy had to maintain its line and maintain its silence. The driver felt the truck respond to each subtle change in the ground, as if the road itself were a living thing, breathing beneath them. The crack had been the warning. The road, as always, was preparing to bare its teeth. The convoy advanced only a few meters beyond the crack when the road finally began to reveal its true condition. The driver felt it first through his feet, a deeper, uneven vibration, almost organic, as if something beneath the surface was slowly giving way. It wasn't constant. It came in pulses, brief tremors that suggested the stability of the terrain was nothing more than a fragile disguise. The truck swayed slightly, not enough to alter its path, but just enough to confirm that something large, something unnatural lay hidden below. The driver shifted his weight, braced his muscles, and kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, even though he knew the danger now lived directly under his wheels. The familiar marks of the road had begun to disappear. The earth, once firm enough to preserve old tire tracks, now appeared freshly disturbed, its textures inconsistent, and its colors revealing layers of soil that should never have been exposed. In some areas, pockets of mud released slow, bubbling breaths, as if trapped air was trying to escape. The driver understood exactly what that meant: subterranean pressure. With each passing meter, the vibration returned, always stronger along the right side of the road, as though that section had been hollowed out from within. The driver eased the speed just enough to allow the truck to read the terrain. These machines, with their massive weight, could sense changes the human eye could not. And today the truck felt restless, sending messages through every metallic groan. The convoy behind him mimicked his movements with near-surgical synchronization. It resembled a single organism made of steel and determination, each truck sensing, reacting and adjusting to the charged atmosphere of the unstable path. The road seemed to narrow again, not physically but in feeling. Invisible boundaries tightened around them, compressing space into a corridor of rising threat. Small rocks began to tumble gently down the slopes, not pushed by impact or wind, but by the shifting earth itself. These were not landslides, they were signals. Fragments breaking away softly, as if the valley were testing its own endurance before fully giving in. The driver noted each quiet fall with absolute attention. The road was warning them, and in war, warnings were never harmless. A thin mist began to form near the ground, drifting in slow, uneven patterns. It rose like vapor from a surface too hot or too unstable to contain what lay beneath it. The fog moved with currents. The driver couldn't feel directly, responding to forces he could only sense through intuition. It was unusual. It was wrong. It was another sign that deep under that fragile crust, the earth was shifting. Tension settled in the driver's chest like a precise weight. He knew they were crossing a landscape shaped not just by nature but by everything the war had carved into it. The enemy didn't need to be present. The remnants left behind were dangerous enough. The road was speaking now, and he had to listen to every silent word before it was too late. The driver pressed forward with extreme caution when he finally sensed the decisive shift. The road no longer behaved like a road. What had once been solid ground now felt like a stretched fabric, strained to its limit, ready to tear under any additional weight. The vibrations, once sporadic, had become constant, as if something beneath the surface was moving with the convoy, matching them step for step. The earth began to sink in a nearly imperceptible way, not a sudden collapse, but a slow, progressive descent, like the ground exhaling after carrying years of accumulated tension. With every meter traveled, the truck dipped slightly before regaining support. This rhythmic, unsettling motion revealed the truth. They were driving over terrain shaped not by nature, but by buried remnants of previous battles. The soil's color betrayed its instability. Darker patches marked areas oversaturated with water, while lighter streaks suggested places where the top layer was dangerously thin. The road, once uniform, had fractured into an uneven mosaic of dirt, mud, and metal fragments, warped remains of vehicles, ammunition casings, and skeletal structures consumed by the war. The feeling of confinement grew stronger despite the openness of the valley. The truck lost traction in subtle pockets and regained it abruptly, as if the ground beneath them alternated between reliability and deception. The steering wheel, once responsive, now resisted with a strange rigidity, transmitting the struggle of a terrain refusing to cooperate. Then a new sound emerged, a low, resonant noise rising from beneath the surface. It wasn't metal, rock, or engine. It was the sound of shifting ground, of something large and hidden rearranging itself under the convoy's weight. A sound that did not belong to the present moment, but to a buried memory reawakening. The driver recognized it not from personal experience, but from stories exchanged among veteran drivers. Hollow ground, formed by old craters, long buried, capable of collapsing without warning, and swallowing whole vehicles. The surrounding slopes grew unnervingly still. Even the wind seemed to falter, as though the environment itself anticipated what might come next. Dust kicked up by the trucks no longer dispersed. It hovered in suspension, as if the air had lost its ability to carry it. They were moving through a space detached from the ordinary world, a space where normal rules no longer applied. The driver did not slow down. The paradox was cruel. Reducing speed could force too much pressure onto a weak point in the soil, but accelerating could rupture the fragile layer completely. The only viable choice was to maintain perfect precision, to keep moving as though the road still existed. But he knew the truth. Beneath the tires, the road was gone. All that remained were buried memories, and they were beginning to wake. The truck had advanced only a few meters beyond the most unstable point when the inevitable finally happened. There was no visual warning, no flicker of light, no clear signal. The road simply decided it had reached its limit. A single, deep impact tore through the world. For an instant, everything seemed to unfold at once. The ground beneath the rear axle of a truck farther ahead gave way, and in the precise millisecond, when the weight of its cargo pressed into the fragile pocket below, the past awakened in the form of an explosion. The detonation was not merely a sound, it was a rupture. The earth arched upward in a violent burst, hurling mud, metal debris, and years of buried war into a single devastating surge. The driver saw just enough to understand. A low flash, close to the ground, a horizontal plume of fire expanding outward. The struck truck lifted violently from the rear, as if thrown by invisible hands before collapsing onto its side, dragging part of the unstable terrain with it. The shockwave traveled across the valley, slamming into his own vehicle like a fist made of air and memory. The cab shook with brutal intensity, making everything tremble, the dashboard, the steering wheel, his bones. The truck lurched sideways, skidding toward the edge of the road. For a heartbeat that stretched far beyond its length, the driver felt the tires fight for traction, clawing desperately against the loosened soil. 1 inch further, and the ground would have swallowed him too. Behind him, the entire convoy absorbed the same invisible blow. Trucks braked hard but could not stop. The rule remained unchanged. A stopped truck became a perfect target. Whether for the enemy above or the earth below, the convoy had to keep moving, even through chaos. Dust, smoke, and fragments of soil and metal filled the air, choking visibility. For several seconds, the road vanished completely, replaced by a swirling cloud that erased depth and direction. The driver relied less on sight and more on instinct, feeling the truck respond to each shift in the ground, as though its weight were being judged by the fragile layer beneath them. When the haze began to settle, the aftermath revealed itself. The truck that had detonated lay on its side, half of its structure swallowed by a fresh crater. The earth around it still trembled faintly, as if holding onto the vibration of the explosion like a fading heartbeat. There were no heroes visible in that wreckage. No banners, no glory, only a rotten machine marking the place where another anonymous life had been claimed. The driver felt the psychological blow more sharply than the physical one. The road had shown its teeth, and yet he had no choice. The line could not break. Every second of hesitation increased the pressure on a terrain already ready to collapse. He kept the truck moving. The road had bitten, but it was far from finished. The convoy regained its rhythm. But something had changed profoundly. It wasn't just the scar left by the recent explosion, or the dust still hanging in the valley. It was the silent awareness settling over every driver in that long line of trucks. The road now felt selective, as if it possessed a will, as if it had begun deciding who was allowed to pass, and who was not meant to go any farther. The driver sensed it immediately. Every sound from the ground seemed louder. Every vibration through the floor gained weight. The truck reacted as a vigilant animal, its tires listening to the terrain before fully gripping it. He eased off the throttle just enough to maintain control, but not enough to give the ground time to think. The valley narrowed as he advanced, compressing the path between rising slopes still wounded by war. Dry craters, exposed roots, scorched trunks, each detail reminded him that this corridor was not a road, but a natural minefield molded by years of abandonment and detonation. In certain patches, rusted fragments jutted from the earth like the bones of a buried giant. Then he noticed something that tightened his breath. Ahead, where the road curved slightly, the color of the soil began to shift. A thin, almost imperceptible strip crossed the path. Darker, denser. Anyone less attentive might mistake it for a damp patch, but he knew better. Soil didn't change color without reason. This was the kind of change that indicated a pocket of air beneath the surface, an unstable chamber formed by erosion, an old impact crater, or perhaps an unexploded device. The origin didn't matter. What mattered was the risk. The trucks ahead had already crossed it, but that brought no comfort. Each vehicle carried different weight, different balance. His truck was heavy, loaded to the threshold, the kind of weight capable of turning fragility into collapse. He approached the dark strip, eyes locked onto it as if he could read its depth. The truck seemed to feel his hesitation, rocking ever so slightly. The engine's hum drowned the valley's sounds, but couldn't silence the tightening knot in his chest, a warning instinctive and undeniable. If he had a choice, he might have stopped there. But he didn't. The convoy behind him depended on his movement, and the terrain left no room for detours. It was forward or become another silent marker in that valley. The distance to the strip shrank. 5 meters. 4. 3. The road waited, and he would cross it, or be swallowed. The truck reached the critical point. The soil beneath the darkened strip didn't just look different, it felt alive, as though it breathed, as though it waited. The driver sensed the suspension dip a few millimeters deeper than normal, almost imperceptible to anyone else, except someone who had learned to listen to the ground like an unpredictable organism. The full weight of the vehicle pressed into that fragile membrane of earth. The sudden silence inside the cab felt so heavy it resembled a verdict. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with a low, resonant hum, as if the landscape itself were preparing to deliver its judgment. The truck advanced 1/2 meter. Nothing. Another 1/2 meter. The ground groaned, a dry, subterranean crack like timber, ready to split. He kept the wheel steady. There was no turning back, no pause, only a single chance to cross that invisible frontier before the valley made its decision. The truck moved forward again, and for a moment that stretched the boundaries of time. The soil simply vanished, not in an explosion, not in a violent collapse, but in a sudden drop, like a deep exhale from the earth. The rear left wheel plunged into a depression that hadn't existed seconds earlier. The driver reacted instantly, accelerating with surgical precision. The engine responded with raw force, pulling the heavy vehicle out of the newborn cavity. The front wheels found traction on a slight rise that offered exactly the support he needed. The truck shook, trembled, swayed, but climbed free. Behind him, the darkened strip collapsed completely, splitting open into a fissure that would swallow any truck attempting to follow his path. There was no logical explanation for the perfect timing, no calculation that could justify the razor-thin margin between survival and disaster. It was as if the road had allowed him to pass. Only him. When he finally reached firmer ground, the tension drained from his muscles in a slow, weighted release. He didn't celebrate. There was no triumph. Only the quiet recognition that he had been spared by a fragment of chance or fate. The truck continued forward, closing the distance to the convoy ahead. The road behind him remained still, as if swallowing the memory of what had happened, erasing any trace of the danger that nearly claimed him. In that moment, the driver understood something only those who cross places that want to kill them ever truly grasp. Some roads are not simply routes, they are judgments. They are living memories of war, deciding who is permitted to continue. And on that particular day, for reasons he would never know, the road chose to let him go. If you made it this far, that puts you among the few who walk the full length of these stories. Those who understand that behind every war lie hidden paths, quiet decisions, and lives almost no one remembers. Stories like these shouldn't disappear. If you want to keep exploring the forgotten edges of history, consider subscribing. That way, you won't miss the next episode, and you help keep alive a journey through memories time nearly erased. See you on the next crossing.